Hello friends and welcome back to my channel. Last week we did this watercolor piece and I promised I would show you how to turn it into an enamel pin. So today we're going to do just that. Let's get started. So the first thing I wanted to do was make the actual shape of the pin. I created this with the intention of putting it within this silhouette. I have another design that is a bit similar that I'll put on screen right now, and I was making this to be a companion piece to that. I'll be doing a Kickstarter for both of these pins starting in a couple of weeks, so stay tuned till the end for more information on that. And yeah, so I started by making the silhouette. I realized later I could have done this step in Adobe Illustrator. I'm working in Photoshop here, and I would have saved myself a bit of time, but I didn't know off the top of my head how to do clipping masks in Illustrator, and I do know how to do them in Photoshop, and that's what I needed to do here. Plus, I ended up needing to do some editing to the watercolor piece, which I'll show you in a minute here. That would have been very difficult for me to do in Illustrator, so it worked out for the best. So what I did is I dragged the watercolor illustration into Photoshop and I made it a clipping mask on the silhouette that I just outlined and painted white. And as you can see here, it's a little bit boring. The design, I didn't really think it through as well as I did my original one, and so the spacing was a little weird. I also realized I made some mistakes on my silhouette thanks to a friend taking a look at it for me. So I did some touching up here. I actually did a lot more touching up than I'm showing in this video, but I cut out a lot of it because it's really boring to watch me just adjust fish lips for 3 hours. It wasn't 3 hours, but that's about how long it took to make the whole thing. So I took a look at the illustration and I decided that I wanted a few elements to be closer to the master sword so that they would show up in the pin. I wanted to get the depth from the tree line in the back and from the shrubbery in the front. These aren't modeled off of any particular kind of plant, I just kind of was making them up based on the art from Breath of the Wild, and I realized after that they weren't like this fern kind of shape like I made them, but you know, they are in my version, so that's just how it's gonna be. So I started picking up pieces and then copying them onto a new layer and moving them to where I thought I would want them. And I was merging all my layers and making the clipping mask again every couple of steps to make sure things looked the way I wanted them to. And you can see I'm being extremely sloppy here. I'm just blocking in the colors if I'm losing areas with a round brush. I'm not trying to recapture the texture because that's going to be lost in the enamel pin making process anyway. So I'm really just focused on shapes and color blocks. Actually probably should have been neater when I was doing this because I did end up having to go back in because I intended to make this as a sticker as well, and I had to go back in and fix a lot of the areas that I'm just color blocking here for the sticker version. But if you're just doing enamel pins, then don't worry about that. Obviously, you'll be fine if you are incredibly sloppy like I'm being here. I even made some mistakes. I realized much later that I cut off part of the pedestal that the Master Sword is on, which is fine because now I'm over in Illustrator and I'll just add it back in while I'm over here editing. So I finally have a composition here that I like. We've got enough of the greenery in the foreground and the background that I feel like it's got some depth. And then we go in and we're gonna start outlining the silhouette again. So if I had planned my initial illustration a little bit better, I would have been able to do this whole process in Illustrator. I mean, I didn't know how to do clipping masks, but you can very much do them in Illustrator the same as you would do them in Photoshop. And there's plenty of tutorials on how to do it. And my original piece that I showed you guys earlier, I had done on a piece of paper that was rectangular, and it was a up and downways illustration. I cannot remember which one is horizontal or vertical ever, but it was long, and this one for the Master Sword I ended up doing on a square piece of paper, and the silhouettes of the faces are thin, so just all the elements that I had put in didn't really line up super well, but I had done it correctly the first time, so just keep in mind what kind of shape your final pin is going to have when you are doing the illustration that you want to translate into an enamel pin, and then you can do this whole process within one program, Illustrator. And there are a lot of free programs you can use for vectors like Inkscape and Vecteezy. I think Vecteezy is even an in-browser one, so you don't even have to download anything, but you do have to make an account. So you can use stuff like that. You don't need to use Illustrator as long as it can save as an Adobe Illustrator file, which they all should be able to do. Your enamel pin manufacturer is going to be able to work with it. So next we're going to start blocking in our bigger shapes after I fiddle with the silhouette for the umpteenth time. And what I recommend is start with the shapes, and this goes for any Adobe Illustrator project. I like to start with the shapes that are closest to us, so to speak, in the composition. So in this case, that would be these very large fern-like leaves. And that way we can kind of see how our illustration is starting to look as we go through the process without having to keep turning on the visibility and turning it off. Later you will see that I learned that from experience because I started blocking in areas in the back before I started working on the master sword, and it's just an unsatisfying workflow for me to have to keep turning layers on and off, so I prefer to work from the front to the back. Also, you've probably noticed, but this isn't really an Adobe Illustrator tutorial if you don't know how to use this program. There are a lot of great ones out there. I'm a real newbie at it, so I'm not great at teaching it. But I will say that most of the stuff I do is either with the paintbrush, which I'm using right here, which works just like a regular paintbrush, or with the curved line tool. And the curved line tool I prefer to the straight line tool because my illustrations tend to use a lot of lines that are softer and curvier. I don't do a lot of hard edges, and you can double click on any anchor point that you're adding to make it into a straight line anchor point, which I'm still kind of learning how to do. But play around with it. Basically, the very easiest way I think I can explain it is that you're putting anchor points on every place in an illustration where the direction of the line changes, and then you can alter the line between those points by curving it up, curving it down, left, right, or whatever until it follows the line you're doing. And I think it makes more sense to watch me do it than for me to explain it. But I wanted to try to at least give you guys a heads up on how to do that because, as I said, this isn't really an Adobe Illustrator tutorial, but if you are primarily a traditional artist, making the jump into a vector program is a little tricky. It took me a couple of sessions to get comfortable with it, and obviously I'm not moving as fast as this video is in real time. This whole process took about 3 hours. Adobe Illustrator is a lot more fiddly than, just working on paper with a paintbrush for me. And I know that's, the opposite for a lot of other people. A lot of people prefer digital mediums, and doing stuff with a real paintbrush stresses them out. But that's just my workflow personally. But yeah, Adobe Illustrator is a very powerful program. It's a good program. I just haven't learned how to use all of its features, so I will be sticking to the most basic explanations in this of like, how do you make shapes with the curved line tool, and just compositional tips for translating traditional illustrations over to Illustrator, because I don't feel qualified to teach you how to do much else. But yeah, just keep putting down your anchor points everywhere that the line changes direction, and then you can just move the line segment between those points until you get a line you're satisfied with. And if you need a sharp corner, double click on that point where the corner is, and it will make it sharp instead of a curve. So yeah, that's the very basic how to use Adobe Illustrator tutorial. Like and subscribe for more bad tutorials, I guess. So let's talk about some things to keep in mind when you're designing enamel pins. The very first thing I would advise, especially for beginners, which I assume if you're watching this video you might be, is to keep your design as simple as possible the first time around. You can get pretty darn detailed with enamel pins, and I have designed pretty complicated ones. This one that you're watching is pretty complicated. But my first design, which I will pop up on the screen here, was incredibly simple. It wasn't a lot of colors, and it was big, chunky, easy shapes that were easy to make with curves in Illustrator. My next tip is to be mindful of how many colors you're using. This one I kind of snapped, and I put a lot of colors. I have not actually even gotten a final count yet. I think it's like 11 or 12, but you want to keep the number lower if you can to control costs. So the more colors your enamel pin has, the more expensive it will be. The other factors that go into the cost are like the shape, if there are any cutouts, and other factors like that. But most pin manufacturers will not charge any more than the base price for up to 4 colors of enamel. Others will charge more, like up to 6 colors. It just depends on the manufacturer you're working with. And then sometimes there are upcharges for things like glitter enamel and things like that. So try to keep the color palette fairly limited. Obviously, I'm not recreating the texture of the watercolor here because that would be a lot of colors. Every different color in a gradient would be its own color, so values count as different colors as well, so that's something to keep in mind. It's not like paint or marker where if you're using, you know, more water or alcohol to dilute it, you're using the same color. In enamel pin making, it is done by Pantones, so every color has to be a distinct color of enamel that will be filled in. A helpful way to think about it, and this was also just helpful for learning how to use Adobe Illustrator in the first place, is to think of it like you are making this out of cut paper. Like you have a bunch of construction paper and it's 3rd grade, and you're trying to recreate this image just with different colors of construction paper. So every tone is going to need a different piece of paper. So fewer pieces of paper to make the final product is better and is going to be cheaper for you in the long run, and it's going to be less overwhelming for you to design. My last design tip is to try to make sure you don't have areas that are going to be very small. So that would count also areas like these where it is one shape within Illustrator, but a enamel pin would still be filling those in as 2 separate areas of enamel because they'll be die struck with the lines and then you fill in the enamel on top of it. So that's something to keep in mind. I do a lot of fiddling with this design to try to accommodate for that. 3mm tends to be the tolerance that most manufacturers can do, but just be mindful of it. Your production manufacturer will let you know if there's an area that's too small, or they will try to fill it in on your proofing process with a gold instead, just with whatever metal plating you chose, to avoid filling in areas that are that tiny. So just try to avoid them if you can in your design phase. If you absolutely need them, just be aware and try to make sure that they are larger than 3mm. And you can also like size up your pin in general to accommodate for that, because pins can go from anywhere from like 1/2 inch to, I mean, 3 inches I think is the biggest standard pin I've seen, and then people go up even bigger than that. You can buy them that are the size of Funko Pops now at GameStop, so you know, just be mindful of the size of things. If you're making giant pins, don't worry about it. So I have talked a lot about the design process and what your manufacturers can and can't do depending on who you're using and your pin size, but let's talk about the manufacturers themselves. So how do you find a manufacturer to work with to make your enamel pins? So there are 2 different ways you can do this. First, there are no enamel pin manufacturers that are manufacturing in the United States, and the ones that there are very few, and they mostly work on much larger orders than you're going to be placing. So I don't recommend trying to do that because it won't be cost effective at all. Most pin manufacturers that are based in the United States, or say they are middlemen who are dealing with pin manufacturers in China. So basically they are communicating with a Chinese factory for you, so you don't have to go hunt them down yourself and figure that process out. The pricing is usually a little bit higher with middlemen. I have had good luck with Stagery Emblems. I think that's how you pronounce it. They are a middleman company, and they made the elephant pins that I put on the screen earlier. I really enjoyed the quality of the pins, though the communication was a little slower than I preferred. Another middleman that I have not ordered from yet, but that has a good reputation and that I have ordered keychains from, is Alchemy Merch, and they are also a middleman. They are very transparent about that, and they are very fast at communicating and very helpful with the design process, especially if you're a newbie and you have questions. They're very friendly and helpful and good at answering your questions as they come up. The last middleman that I am personally familiar with, I have not used them, but I have friends who have, is Wizard Pins, and they are advertising on Facebook all the time, so it's possible, like, if you've been Googling enamel pin making, they have come up. And I have heard that their quality is pretty good and their communication is good, though it is a bit of a mixed bag there. So those are some middlemen that you can talk to communicate with Chinese factories for you if you don't want to go to direct. So the second option is going direct. In this scenario, you would talk directly to a Chinese factory yourself, and you would get basically the wholesale price for the pins, and they will communicate with you. So The best way to do this, I have found, is to go through a website like Alibaba, and that seems to be where everyone else goes, and to search for custom enamel pin manufacturing, and tons of companies will come up. The upside of this is it's cheaper than going through a middleman because you don't have to pay the middleman. The downside is that for beginners, it can be a lot more confusing and complicated because there is a certain level of understanding that is more expected when you're going direct, and also things can get lost in translation. You don't have to be able to speak Chinese. Almost everyone who works in these factories in contact on Alibaba speaks English, which is really, really impressive, and they're always very nice, but things can get lost in translation from time to time, and they may not be able to give you the specific feedback in a way that is easy for you to understand, just due to inexperience with the enamel pin making process. That said, I did make the very first enamel pin that I sourced, which was a design that I did with my wife. It was more of a collaboration than the elephant pin, so I don't really count it as mine, it was ours. But I did do that through a Chinese factory, and they were really helpful. It was my very first time, and I had a lot of silly questions, and they were super helpful and nice, and I had a good experience with them. I will say also shipping times when you go direct through the factory tend to be a little less predictable than the middlemen, because the middlemen generally, one, have better shipping relationships with FedEx and UPS and are more familiar with the process, and two, they are likely getting shipments of other pins in with yours to save on shipping costs, and so they have a much better vision of the schedule. So if you're not experienced, I would say definitely go with a middleman for your first manufacturing experience. I was comfortable going direct because I work in manufacturing, not in enamel pins, but manufacturing prototype parts and things like that at my day job, so I was very comfortable going direct to a factory because a big part of my job is communicating directly with factories in China. But yeah, if you're new, I would say go with a middleman, one of the companies I listed, and that will do just fine for you. And even though they're a little more expensive, after shipping and stuff is all worked out, it's about the same. And Stagery Emblems in particular is a very well-priced company, and they actually have an online quote form as well, which I'll link in the description, so you can budget the pricing of your pins based on the design before you even have to talk to somebody. So yeah, that's basically all of the advice that I have for making your first enamel pin. These are really hot on Kickstarter right now, so it's definitely a cool way to get your art out there. This is this finished pin, and as I mentioned, this will be up on Kickstarter in the next couple of weeks, and I'll make an announcement here when it and the companion pin that I showed earlier are available for pre-orders. So thank you so much for coming to this video. Please like and subscribe if you want to learn more stuff about other stuff. Have a lovely day!